Welcome to Season 2 of Assessment in Focus, the podcast from Inspira, where we invite our guests to share their insights on assessment, transformation, innovation, and enhancement. I'm delighted this time to be joined by Naomi Winstone, who is a professor of educational psychology in the Surrey Institute of Education at the University of Surrey. Naomi is also an honorary professor at the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning, CRADL, at Deakin University in Australia, and a principal fellow of the HEA, as well as being a UK National Teaching Fellow. In 2019, she co-authored a book with David Carless, Designing Effective Feedback Processes in Higher Education, a learning-focused approach that set the agenda for new approaches to feedback policy and practice. Using her research and institutional leadership experience, Naomi works with schools, universities, and organizations across the world to embed learning-focused approaches to feedback in practice, and therefore is a brilliant guest to be with us. Thank you very much, Naomi, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Naomi, I have some questions for you, and I know that the audience are interested, as they always are, in this sort of global approach, and then more specifically how it's applied to assessment and feedback, whether it's the NSS in the UK or the equivalents in other countries, or indeed just generally the fact that we know that good feedback is good for students, to overly generalize it, I suppose. The insights you're going to give us are going to be great, and I'm going to go straight into my first question, which is, what is one practical change that an individual academic could make next year that would genuinely improve the student experience of assessment or feedback?
Thank you. It's a great question to start with. I'm a big believer in the value of the aggregation of marginal gains. So the idea that if we can make small changes to different parts of the assessment and feedback process, together they add up to a really big change without any individual academic having to do anything that's too difficult in the constraints of workload and regulations and all of the things that guide what we do in assessment. So I think one of those small steps is a really simple reframing. And it's one of the things that I've advocated for many years, is to reframe what we see as when feedback happens or when feedback has happened. So typically in higher education, we've had a very transmission-oriented approach to feedback, where we've seen the delivery of comments as being feedback. And if, as an educator, we've written comments, we've uploaded them into the virtual learning environment or the learning management system, then we've discharged our responsibility and feedback has happened. The shift that I call for is to say that's not the end of the feedback process. That's only the beginning, because it's what happens next that turns those comments into feedback. Otherwise, they're just information, or what Royce Sadler called dangling data. They're not doing any work. So anything we can do to focus on what happens next after we've given those comments to our students, how do we help them make sense of those comments, to use them, to put them into practice? And one of the simple ways we can do this is simply to rethink the timing of when we engage in feedback with our students. In almost all cases, detailed comments at the end of a module or unit after work has been graded is the least useful time for students to be given feedback information. There's very little opportunity for them to use it. So really thinking very carefully about the time we spend on feedback encounters with students, and where we can reposition that time so that it has the maximum impact, give students the opportunity to use it, and just asking that question all the time: what happens next? What are students going to do with the information that I provide? I think that's the most powerful thing we could do.
There's often a concern that if we move feedback, for example, to earlier in the module or whatever period of time we want, it's not going to capture all the feedback that we might want to give the student. So I'll just defer it all to the end. How can an educator deal with that best, to think those feedback moments still have value even if they're not at the end of the module?
Yeah, it's really thinking about, what do we want our feedback processes to achieve? And often we want to give feedback on work in progress, because that's where students can feel this is going to have a real impact, because I can go away and I can take these comments and apply them to what I'm working on now. But then when it comes to the end, typically feedback takes on the flavor of grade justification, that it's almost trying to say, this is why we've given this mark, and here's the words that justify why that's the case. And that's not so useful. But we can still do useful activities at the end that don't add too much extra workload if we've spent time giving detailed feedback earlier on. And one of those that I think is really, really useful is to rethink how we use cohort level feedback or group feedback. Because sometimes I think there's a perception that this is a cop-out, that we're trying to save time, and rather than writing individual feedback, we write general information about what was done well and common errors. There's actually real value to this for students. And when we've spoken to them about it, they said things like, when we understand why you're doing it, we can see that it's really valuable for us to know what errors other people made that we didn't make, or some of the good things that were done by others that I hadn't thought about doing in my own work. And we've just recently launched an online resource called Feedback in Power Tools, which is lots of resources to help students make use of feedback. And one of the sections in that resource is all about helping students make use of feedback that was directed at a whole group of people, but to extract the personally relevant information from it.
I think it also answers, doesn't it, when students say, where's the rest of the feedback? That is the rest of the feedback. It's how you compared to others. I wanted to ask you your views on video feedback and audio feedback in addition to written feedback. It's a two-part question. Where do you see its value, and where do you think people need to be careful that they're not using that and still falling into the same traps as before?
It's a really good question. And the literature on audio feedback, video feedback, screencast feedback gives us a really clear message that it has some really clear affordances, that for students, it can feel more engaging. It softens the emotional blow because by facial expressions and tone of voice, students experience the care of their teachers. There are challenges, though. You're absolutely right. And I think one of the risks is that if we just focus on using a medium like video for providing comments, we're just replicating that transmission model, but with something a little bit more shiny. But how could we use those same media to encourage response to feedback? So let's say, for example, we use screencast feedback, and I've got my students' work on screen, and as I'm marking it or as I'm reading through, I'm literally highlighting. I might correct a reference that's incorrect. But then I say, right, I've done that for 3 of them. Now I want you to apply those comments to the rest of the work, screencast what you're doing and send it back to me. And it creates more of a dialogue. It captures response to feedback in a way that's perhaps quite challenging to do otherwise. So I think, yes, there's value, certainly in terms of social presence, care, and the nuance of communication, huge value, but we need to use it to encourage response to feedback, not just delivery in another medium.
Thank you. There's an aligned point to that is I, like so many others, a big proponent of us moving towards programmatic assessment, although, of course, I don't have to do it, and I know that there's a huge amount of work involved to do it. Just playing it forward, if we do move to, or programs move to programmatic assessment, yes, the ability to give feedback over a range of modules and tasks will get better. But again, looking to the future, how do we prevent it from simply being a canon of feedback for a lot of assessments or a lot of things assessed together and falling into the same trap of it's grade justification, it doesn't actually help with the next part?
Yeah, a really good question. And modularized curricula creates so many challenges that artificially compartmentalize learning and processes like feedback. One of the things that I think we don't do enough of in higher education, because it's really challenging to do at scale, is ipsative feedback. So Bianca Maleka and David Boud have written a few papers about this idea of ipsative feedback, that rather than feedback commenting on absolute performance in what particular task, it actually talks about development or change since a previous piece of work or a previous reference point. And this is really challenging to do with a modularized system, because you don't know what students have done before. We should know exactly what they've done before and what they're going to do next. But even if we have a rough idea of the task, we haven't seen the feedback that the previous module leader gave to them. So it's very difficult to comment on improvements rather than just absolute performance. But I think this could be a real affordance of AI in feedback processes, that there could be a way of AI being deployed to facilitate that ipsative element of feedback. And we know that this is much more valuable for students because it's commenting on where they've been, where they need to go next, with reference to the trajectory of their work, rather than just that one piece that we're looking at one point in time.
I hope that what the viewers and listeners, depending on how you're consuming this podcast, can see from that is that feedback is actually one of the things that can drive assessment redesign, because in order to get those affordances, the assessments need to look and feel different. And ultimately, that's a wonderful benefit for students actually having something they can use from it. I taught people who were going off to go to the bar, and I know the difference between the feedback that I gave, where one of my former students contacted me a couple of years ago and said, I still have the piece of paper you gave me. And I thought it was actually a piece of feedback, but it wasn't. It was a student who, there's a small chance they're listening, but I'm sure they wouldn't mind, who would walk about a lot when they were talking. And I gave them a piece of paper and put it on the floor and said, one foot has to be on this at all times. And he told me for his first 2 years at the bar, that piece of paper, or I'm sure it was like Trigger's broom, there's lots of pieces of paper, went everywhere with him. And I felt like that was a really useful piece of feedback versus, all the other comments I might have written. But as we look at students, what do students understand about assessment that institutions often overlook?
I think students understand a lot more than we often give them credit for. One of the things, of course, that we never see, but that we know happens, is that they talk to each other a lot. On social media, in the bar, they talk about assessment, and they talk about feedback, and they talk about what different members of staff might have said to them about their work in progress. And so these little inconsistencies, which are a natural part of feedback always has inconsistencies because it's personal judgment, but they get magnified because then suddenly the emotional stakes of the feedback in the assessment system come into mind. And so they become probably bigger issues than they need to be. But we, again, in our feedback in Power Tools, we have a section in there which is all about dealing with inconsistent feedback, because I think this is a really important thing we need to support our students to do, because when they're in the workplace, they will get inconsistent feedback from clients, from colleagues. For academics, we get reviewer 1 and reviewer 2 saying completely different things about our papers, and we have to reconcile those. So I think that the conversations that students have with each other about assessment can actually be really generative if we can help them use those conversations effectively. I think the other thing that students maybe see that we see in a different way comes back to this issue of modularization and programmatic approaches. That for an individual module leader, they are teaching a chunk of the student's journey at that point in time. They're helping students with 1, maybe 2 pieces of assessment. But for students, assessment is it's everything. It's happening every day, when they're in the library, when they're talking to their friends, when they're in a lecture. All of these things, assessment is threaded through from multiple modules at the same time. And so the more we can talk to each other as educators and understand what's going on for students in other modules, in other areas of the curriculum at that time, the more I think we can start to make things a little bit more cohesive so that they don't feel so separate and compartmentalized.
I can see the real value in that. And there's something I heard last week at a conference that I attended, which was that we ought to explain to students why we've chosen the assessment vehicle that we have, not only to gain their better understanding, but also as a reflective point for ourselves to wonder if this is the right type of assessment. Any advice you have for people who might be looking to do that, as to, well, how to assess their assessment of their assessment, if that isn't using the word too many times?
Yeah, I completely agree with this. And going back 6 or 7 years ago now, we had a project. At the time, what was then HEFKI was funding these big projects about removing barriers to student success. And we had a project which was around inclusive assessment. And one of the things we did as part of that project was to redesign our assessment brief template, to make sure that any hidden assumptions about assessment, or things that some students would get because they were confident to go to office hours and ask the questions, wouldn't then put other students at disadvantage. And one of the sections that we put in the assessment brief template was why I've chosen this assessment. And it was a much more informal narrative part of the assessment brief. but it was almost visualizing the design journey and the decisions that the module leader had made. And I think this is incredibly important, because there might be a really good reason why we want students to come and do an in-person exam, or there might be a really good reason why we really would like them to do a group presentation even though they don't want to do it. And the more that we can surface that and show that we've given really careful thought and design to assessment. I would go one step further though as well and say that we also need to do the same for feedback. So David Bowd and I wrote a paper a few years ago called The Need to Disentangle Assessment and Feedback in Higher Education. And we argued that a lot of the problems that we see with feedback, because it's always tied to assessment, it's the thing that happens after we've graded student work. And so we argued that feedback needs a design focus in its own right. And so I think as part of that communication, we should also be saying to students, this is where I've decided to embed feedback processes into this 11-week the time that we have together, and this is why, and this is how I think you will then be able to make use of it. I think that makes a massive difference as well.
It really does. And you can see, I remember when I taught, we went to great lengths to say to students, feedback isn't just that document called feedback at the end of an assessment. The dialogue we have in class, the questions there's feedback, potentially feedback involved in all of that. So yeah, I suppose the question that I come up with is, in terms of, well, I'll actually move to my next one because it encompasses what I wanted to say, which is we've spent a lot of time improving feedback and talking about feedback. What is it that we misunderstand or don't understand about how students use it? And I tell this story, which I've told at least once on this podcast before, possibly twice. I'm sure somebody will tell me if it's in every episode. But I still remember the students, the difference between the ones who would take my feedback at the end of a piece of advocacy and pore over every word, and the ones who would scoop it up in one go and put it straight in their bag, and I'm sure it never saw the light of day. So, yeah, what do we misunderstand? What do we not understand?
Yeah.
To prove that these are real podcasts, phones ring. Absolutely fine. I was going to say, at least half of my episodes have the noise from my Google Meet as well.
Sorry, I should have turned things off.
Absolutely fine. Teams, I'm sure that lots of people listening will think it's their Teams going. It's fine. We'll leave it in.
Apologies. Yes, now I've lost my thread completely.
Misunderstood about feedback or just not understand?
Yes. So when we look at students' actual behaviour at that point that feedback is released to them, there's lots of really quite depressing studies that show how few students actually open the feedback, or let alone read it, let alone do something with it. So there's a challenge there, I think, about assuming that the feedback that we provide is what students want and what they need. And that again brings us back to thinking about timing. So if we're just giving them feedback at the end, it's probably not going to have much influence. It's not going to be that helpful, and they may not want it at all. And so then we need to think, well, when should we be embedding feedback so that it can have more of an impact? And I have a brilliant image that I often show in talks, and it's over 10 years ago now, so it's old school analog assessment. So it's a set of pigeonholes where marked work is returned to students. I'm sure we both experienced this. And I was at a university one summer and I was doing some work for them. They were telling me how amazing their feedback was, and they were writing pages and pages of feedback, and they thought they were sector leading. And then I walked down this corridor and find this set of pigeonholes stacked full of uncollected feedback. This is the middle of the summer. The students had gone home, and I affectionately refer to this image as a feedback graveyard, because there's just hours and hours of staff effort and time that is never even going to be looked at by students. And that to me illustrates then what we need to think about in terms of what students think that we don't know about. And people might look at that and say, well, that just shows students aren't interested. They're not engaged. They're not engaging in the process. To me, that image is just fundamentally a design flaw. It's feedback happening at the wrong time and in the wrong place for students to be able to use it. So I think what we misunderstand is really what we might interpret as disengagement or engagement. It's actually a lot more complex than that. There's so many stages, from whether students even want that feedback in the first place, to how they appraise or trust the person giving it to them, to whether they revisit it at a time when it might be useful in the future. It's very, very complex, this idea of engagement with feedback. It's not just as simple as looking at it or reading it.
And on that looking at it and reading it point, I know that, again, I always wonder with these things, how much is me, how much is people? I know that a written piece of feedback by itself doesn't really help me. I almost always have a question that I want to ask about it, or a dialogue that I want to have. And again, thinking that forward, I'm sure there'll be academics watching or listening thinking, I don't have the time to speak to 400 students or 100 or 40 or whatever it might be. How do we need to redesign our process to make sure that there is that space to be able to have even 5 or 10 minutes, which would have a greater value exponentially than the piece of paper?
Yeah. Again, it comes back to really thinking carefully about the precious resource that we have to invest into feedback processes, and where can it have the biggest effect. And it's probably not going to be at the end. So what if we were to change our perception of workload in feedback, and say, rather than you've got half an hour to spend on every assignment for writing comments and grading it, to recognize that the work of assessment and feedback it goes on throughout the module and beyond. It's not just that thing that you do when you have a piece of work to grade. So I think that's one thing. The other is to think creatively about what it means for students to be able to ask questions or engage in dialogue. And it may not mean 5 minutes individually with every single student. We had a practice that we featured in some of our work before, where somebody used feedback webinars after work had been returned. So she graded every piece of work. There was individual feedback as normal. And then she scheduled a 1 hour informal online webinar. She spent about 10 minutes going through the generic cohort feedback. These are the things that were done well. These were the common errors. And then she had an anonymous polling tool where students could submit questions about their own feedback, about how to apply it. And what I really liked about this practice is that it was much more inclusive than those 5-minute behind closed doors conversations, because students heard the responses to every question and got a lot more out of it than they would do just from their own 5 minutes. So I think we can think creatively about how we engage in dialogue as well.
Yeah, that's an incredibly creative way of doing it. I know that I used something similar in class where I had several seminars where students didn't want to put their hand up and ask a question, but when I gave them the ability to ask anonymously and they came up on screen, my goodness, the engagement went through the roof. That is a genuine takeaway for people. That's an hour for a cohort of a decent size where people will ask questions and they will use that anonymity. That's great. I really hope people take that one away.
There were 600 students in this group.
Wow.
They didn't all come to the webinar.
No.
They didn't all ask questions, but it was a way of if you did 5 minutes with 600 students, it would take a ridiculously long amount of time. There are other ways.
Absolutely. And you can guarantee that the ones who did ask questions, at least one question on there, if not more, if not all, were questions that at least another person was thinking of asking. So yeah, you've at least doubled with my chainsaw maths what you actually managed to do. Let me ask you an incredibly broad question, but it's broad for a reason. And I've asked several of the guests in this season the same question to give them a chance to go wherever they want with it, which is, will AI in its various forms transform or undermine educational assessment? Or is, as I predict, the answer far more nuanced than that?
I think the answer is it's up to us to decide. I genuinely think we're in a position where we can choose how we want AI to drive education and how we want it to fit within education. In terms of assessment, I think there were a lot of problems with assessment which were there long before ChatGPT arrived into our lives. And all that AI has done has sharpened the focus of that challenge and made us go, okay, yeah, we can't ignore that problem anymore. Things like relying on a polished essay as evidence against learning outcomes is a proxy for the learning that takes place. That has been thrown into the spotlight now, because we see it as a proxy because GenAI could write it. But that problem of inferring learning from artifacts has always been there. So I think this is actually a really positive time for us to confront many of those things that we needed to confront before. And our assessment design model, which we've recently published in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, is called Black Box Assessment. And it's essentially a process-focused assessment design, which says we no longer should be worried about students producing beautiful, polished work. Instead, we should care about how far they've travelled to get there, and capturing some of the processes within the black box to provide evidence of that. So I think with assessment, it's actually a really strong opportunity to weed out the practices that we knew were problematic, but we've never really confronted before. I think feedback is more complex because feedback is a really complicated, time-consuming part of our work, and we're also in a system and a structure at the moment across the sector where resources are really, really tight. So this tool comes along that can solve all of those problems at once, and can seem really attractive. But again, we don't want to just use GenAI to replicate the transmission of feedback comments. We can do way more with GenAI than that in feedback processes. And we put out a manifesto for feedback in the age of generative AI, which really argues these are the things we need to hold on to. AI can be used and will be used, but if we can keep some of these principles really, really strong in our minds, then we will be embedding AI into assessment and feedback in ways that are probably more productive.
And I think that is, when you see the polarized debates online, the bit in the middle is exactly that. We have a choice on how to do it. I mean, we have institutions who've said very clearly, no AI for us at all, please. And others who've said a big red button so that we know when something has AI so that we can make an informed choice. And I think that both of those are tenable positions, but carefully considered rather than saying it has to be all or nothing. But looking specifically at AI in grading and feedback and considering the difference between the two, do you think that AI is capable of doing that to a level that's, again, apologies for the multi-part question, acceptable to educators, acceptable to students, acceptable to institutions? What is the educator's role going to be in this if we start using AI?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and one we need to break down. So is AI capable of grading work to an acceptable standard? I haven't been convinced yet that it can. And I think whenever we're talking about work that carries credit, that is high stakes assessment, we have an ethical duty to keep the human element of grading and judgment. We know it's really complex. We know it's something that takes a lot of time, but I think in terms of trust and confidence in that process, humans really are essential. Can AI generate feedback comments to an acceptable standard? Yes, definitely. And again, this is why it's so attractive, because it can do it at speed, at scale, and solve a massive problem that we have. But notice I said there, can it generate feedback comments? Yes. Can it do feedback? No, because feedback is a process and it involves design and it involves human connection. It's a social practice. It's one where the comments that we write are not just the words on a page. We bring into the comments that we write understanding of what students might be struggling with in other areas of the curriculum, what might be going on in other places. So we bring more to our feedback than just the ability to write words about their work. And I think the other really important point that I keep emphasizing at the moment about AI and assessment and feedback is there's a real risk to us as educators if grading and feedback are outsourced to AI, because it's one of the biggest sources of feedback we get on our teaching, where we know where students are struggling, things that have really suddenly clicked for a student. If we no longer engage in depth with their work, we're missing out on a massive source of feedback for us on how students are learning in our classes.
I wonder too then if we can link all this together and think, if I'm not enjoying writing feedback on the submissions that I'm reading, I'm probably got the wrong assessment in the first place. I won't go as far as saying fun, because sometimes it isn't fun, but there should be some element of enjoyment in seeing what the students have produced. I know certainly that when I graded advocacy performances, it was great to see what people actually did after 10 weeks of instruction. Uh, to what extent should we be then looking at, if I'm, as well as being time poor, if I'm looking to outsource all my comments, what is that telling me about my assessment?
It's a really, really important insight. And assessment has had all its joy taken out of it. And how that has happened is how assessment and feedback have become more bureaucratic. And the more artifacts that we have to produce to show that things have happened. Just like your example there, we've got a quote in one of our papers where somebody who worked in a creative arts discipline was talking about the processes of feedback, and she said, in the moment when I'm looking at students' work, it's joyous, it's so rewarding, and it reminds me why I wanted to go into education. She said, and then I have to go and open up a document and fill
Yeah.
in boxes on a form, and
Yeah.
suddenly we'd taken this really natural, very celebratory process and reduced it to bureaucracy and paperwork. And that's the thing. I think we get so hung up on the artifacts, so showing that feedback has taken place at a particular point in time, we forget what feedback actually means and what it should feel like for us as well.
That's an excellent point. And it's one that we're going to have to resolve over time as people think about their assessment design and the bureaucracy that goes with it. For sure. I mean, I'm a fan of bureaucracy in the right places, but I'm not sure that we always get it right. Well, we get people to do. It goes to your point earlier about grade justification
Yeah.
rather than actual feedback.
But again, I think this is where the advantage or the opportunity of AI is actually going to work in our favour. So we've just finished at Surrey a university-wide assessment redesign. So every single module had to look at its assessment and redesign if it was vulnerable to AI. And I can remember sitting in one of these workshops with somebody coming up with this amazing creative idea and just suddenly saying, I'm actually really excited about assessment for the first time. Because suddenly it's like, well, I don't need to keep my essay. It's not working. I can do something really different that's probably more enjoyable for me and for my students. So it's an opportunity to be creative.
Well, thinking about that creativity, I'm going to come to my final question. When we speak again in 5 years' time, what do you really genuinely hope has changed about assessment, and what will it take to get us there?
Yeah, so I think in terms of assessment, what I would really like to see, and it's driven by AI, but it was there before, is moving away from privileging polished work and the idea that we want to see the best thing that students can give us. The whole principle of black box assessment is that there is so much value to error and changes of direction as powerful evidence of learning. Yet we still want students to give us the best piece of work that they can. And those two things are in conflict. So
Mm.
I think if we can shift towards more process forms of assessment, it's not a perfect model. There are challenges with process assessment, but I do believe it's one of the best options that we have in response to AI. And if we can adopt a form of process assessment that really values mistakes and errors and give students credit for distance traveled rather than being able to, in high stakes situation, produce one brilliant piece of work, I really think that would make a change to the experience for us and for students.
Yeah, a massive change. I should say, I'm not suggesting we won't speak for 5 years. No, that must be it. I would very much hope we'd speak much more soon, much sooner than that. Naomi, thank you. That has been a genuinely fascinating conversation. I know there's lots that people have been able to take away from this. Before we go, you've mentioned lots of things during the course of the podcast, and I hope that you'll send me some links so we can put them underneath the podcast recording itself. But anything in specific that you want to plug, and don't limit yourself to one, have as many as you like.
It's a great opportunity to do so. I think my approach with my research has always been to do the research and then think about the route to practice and the practical application. So feedback in Power Tools is one such application. It's freely available. We don't have a subscription to it, and the idea is that it genuinely can empower learners to engage with feedback in different ways. Black box assessment model has just come out. Again, we're very honest in the paper that there are challenges with process assessment and it needs really careful implementation. But I do believe that it's one of the best resources we have available at the moment in this assessment design challenge.
We'll make sure that both of those are available for people to be able to click on underneath this. So thank you again for the discussion. Thank you for joining us. And as always, I want to thank our listeners and sometimes viewers. We have a combination of people either listening or actually watching the video cast. If you found this useful, please like, subscribe, share, all the usual things. A review is always nice too, if you've got time for one of those. And thank you, of course, for joining us. Assessment in Focus is brought to you by Inspira, providing flexible assessment with integrity. I've been Ishan Kolhatkar, as always, and I will see you again next time. Thank you very much.